Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku bonded with the living genome. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The salt was a persistent thief. It stole the scent of everything else, replacing it with a monotonous, corrosive tang that clung to the back of the throat. It worked its way into the labyrinthine mountains of rusted metal and forgotten plastics, cloaking the decay of a generation in the brine of the ocean. For Izuku Midoriya, the salt was just another form of resistance, another weight to push against in his Sisyphean quest. Dagoba Municipal Beach Park was a misnomer of the highest order. It was less a park and more a scar, a coastal landfill where the city's forgotten refuse came to die, bleached by the sun and battered by the tide. It was here, amidst the broken skeletons of washing machines and the tangled intestines of fishing nets, that Izuku had chosen to forge himself. His muscles screamed. Each sinew in his arms felt like a guitar string tuned a note too high, vibrating with the promise of snapping. His hands, though calloused from months of this self-inflicted punishment, were raw and bleeding in new places. He was currently locked in a battle of wills with a refrigerator that had likely been state-of-the-art when All Might was still a rookie. Its door had been torn off, and its hollowed-out frame was filled with sand and sodden debris, making it an anchor of immense, immovable weight. It's not bad to dream, young man. Just make sure your dreams are attainable. Realistic. The doctor's words, a gentle poison administered years ago, echoed in his mind, a counter-melody to the crashing waves. Quirkless. A 4% anomaly in a world of wonders. A biological dead end. The word had been a death sentence for his dream, a final, irrevocable judgment. But then, there was All Might. The video, worn out on his computer from a billion replays, was a holy text, the symbol of peace, hauling dozens of people from a disaster site, his smile a sunbeam cutting through the smoke. Why do I smile? The younger All Might had boomed in the grainy footage. Because in the face of overwhelming pressure and fear, it's a self-reassurance. A way to trick the fear and save those who need me. That was the core of it. The pressure. The fear. Izuku felt it every day. The pressure of his own inadequacy, the fear that he was, and always would be, utterly useless. So, he had created his own pressure, his own impossible task. The Clean Up the Coast Hero Initiative, he'd called it in the privacy of his own mind. If he couldn't lift a car with his bare hands like a top-tier hero, he would train until he could lift a refrigerator. If he couldn't fly, he would run until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He would build a body worthy of being a hero's vessel, even if the spirit within was doomed to be powerless. With a final, guttural roar that was swallowed by the ocean's roar, Izuku put his back into it. His sneakers, worn thin and full of sand, slipped against a patch of slick, rusted metal. The refrigerator didn't budge. It seemed to mock him, a monument to his own futility. He collapsed onto his knees, chest heaving, sweat plastering his green-black hair to his forehead. Defeat tasted like salt and blood from a bitten lip. He looked at his hands. The scabs from yesterday's work had torn open. New crimson welled up, mixing with the grime. He was 14 years old, and he felt ancient. It's not enough, he whispered, the words a puff of steam in the cool evening air. It's never going to be enough. His gaze drifted across the metallic landscape. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet that were cruelly beautiful against the backdrop of junk. He needed to find smaller, more manageable pieces if he was going to make any more progress before dark. That was the rule, fill his daily quota, no matter what. He pushed himself up, his body groaning in protest, and began to scavenge near the base of a particularly large junk pile, a precarious mountain of cars, girders, and discarded electronics that had been there for so long, it was practically a geological feature. He was looking for tires, microwaves, things he could actually carry. As he pulled away a warped sheet of corrugated iron, he saw it. It wasn't buried deep, but tucked away in a small cavity behind a defunct industrial freezer, as if it had been deliberately hidden rather than merely discarded. It was a cylinder, about the length of his forearm and as thick as a fire extinguisher. The material was a dull, matte gray metal that seemed to absorb the light, showing no signs of rust despite its surroundings. It was scarred and dented in several places, but a section of it remained strangely pristine. Intricate markings were etched into this clean section. A stylized logo dominated the space, a beautifully complex design of an octopus, its tentacles interwoven with the spiraling ladder of a double helix. Below it, in a stark, futuristic font, were the words, Takabata Biotech, Project Chimera, Specimen Container / Genesis 01 / Biohazard Level 5. Izuku's breath caught in his chest. His analytical mind, the one that had filled 13 notebooks with detailed hero analysis, kicked into overdrive. Takabata Biotech. The name was vaguely familiar, a ghost from pre-quirk history lessons. They were one of the pioneers in genetic engineering, predating the dawn of quarks by a few decades. They had been shut down after a series of controversial experiments went public. Biohazard Level 5, that was the highest classification. Reserved for incurable, world-ending pathogens. What was something like this doing here? This wasn't just trash. This was an artifact. A dangerous one. His common sense, a small, timid voice in the back of his head, screamed at him to back away, to call the authorities, to run. But the rest of him, the part that was desperate for a sign, for anything that could change his fate, was captivated. Genesis 01. The beginning. He reached out a trembling hand and touched its surface. It was cold. Not the ambient cool of metal in the evening air, but an unnatural, deep-seated cold that felt like it was actively leaching the warmth from his fingertips. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the casing, a low thrum of contained power. He had to know. The compulsion was overwhelming, a thirst he hadn't known he had. He needed to see what was inside. He picked up the tire iron he'd been using as a lever, its rust flaking off on his already filthy gloves. He examined the cylinder, searching for a seam, a latch, a panel. He found a circular hatch on the top, but it was fused shut by time or design. A series of heavy-duty bolts ringed its edge, but they were stripped and corroded. Frustration mounted. He wedged the tip of the tire iron into a dent near the seam of the hatch, hoping to get some leverage. He put his weight into it. The metal groaned in protest. He pushed harder, his desperation lending him a surge of adrenaline. It happened in an instant of terrible, screeching finality. The corroded metal around the dent didn't bend. It fractured. With a sharp hiss like a punctured lung, the internal pressure equalized. Before Izuku could even process the sound, the fractured seam blew outward. A spray of thick, viscous liquid erupted from the container. It wasn't a gas or a simple fluid. It was a substance that defied easy description, an iridescent, opalescent gel that shimmered with all the colors of an oil slick on water. It moved with a horrifying aliveness, not just arcing through the air but reaching. It struck his left arm, from his wrist to his elbow. The sensation was not of wetness. It was a violation. Ice and fire warred across his skin. An electric shock of unimaginable intensity coursed through him, making every nerve ending ignite in a symphony of pure agony. He screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. He stumbled back, crashing into a pile of scrap metal, his eyes wide with horror as he looked at his arm. The substance wasn't dripping off. It was sinking in. Like ink bleeding into paper, the shimmering, rainbow gel flattened against his skin and began to absorb, the edges turning a sickening black as they merged with his flesh. He could feel it. He could feel it moving under his skin, a writhing, slithering cold that was burrowing into his muscle, his bone, his very cells. "Get it off!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. He clawed at his arm with his other hand, his fingernails scraping uselessly against his own skin. It was like trying to scoop water out of water. The substance was already part of him. Black, web-like veins spread from the impact zone, crawling up his arm towards his shoulder, a network of invading darkness. The pain escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. It felt like his arm was being simultaneously frozen, burned, electrocuted, and torn apart on a molecular level. His vision swam. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of screaming colors. His brain, unable to process the sensory overload, felt like it was being scraped raw. He felt a distinct, alien presence in his mind. It wasn't a voice, not a thought. It was a cold, calculating awareness. Data flooded his consciousness, a torrent of information he couldn't comprehend. Biological host detected, Homo sapiens. Quirk factor, null. Host condition, suboptimal. Malnourished. Extreme physical stress. Initiating biointegration sequence. Warning, host is resisting. Catastrophic neurological shock imminent. Analyzing host genome. Compatibility at 98.7%. Acceptable. Forceful integration commencing. Overriding host consciousness. The data stream was the last thing he perceived. The pain became a white, roaring singularity that consumed everything. His last coherent thought was a single, pathetic whimper. Mom! And then, the world went black. There was no dream. There was no light at the end of a tunnel. There was only the void, and in the void, there was a process. It was the feeling of being unmade. He was a tapestry of flesh and bone, and something was pulling at his threads. Each strand of his DNA was isolated, examined, catalogued. A billion years of evolution, from single-celled organism to sentient primate, laid bare and dissected by a cold, alien logic. His memories, his fears, his dreams of being a hero, they were all just electrical impulses, chemical data to be sorted and filed. Then came the reweaving. The foreign threads, shimmering and complex, began to knit themselves into his own. It was not a replacement, but an augmentation. A new layer of code was being written over his old operating system. Where there was a vulnerability, it was patched. Where there was inefficiency, it was optimized. The process was methodical, relentless, and utterly devoid of malice or compassion. It was simply what it was designed to do: survive, integrate, and improve. Host genome integration, 23%. Stabilizing host vital signs. Repairing cellular damage from forced bonding. Neurological pathways recalibrating. Sensory inputs being diverted and augmented. Host body is weak. Requires reinforcement. Beginning physical optimization protocols. Microfractures in skeletal structure detected. Applying calcium redeposit matrix. Lactic acid buildup in muscle tissue, 94%. Purging toxins. Integration complete. Standby mode. Monitoring host. The cold calculus faded, leaving behind a silent, humming stillness. The void remained, but it was no longer empty. It now held two presences, intertwined and inseparable. Izuku's first sensation upon returning to consciousness was the rhythmic crash of waves. It was a gentle, soothing sound that was immediately at odds with the memory of searing, world-ending pain. He blinked, his eyelashes heavy with sand. The sky above was a deep, bruised purple, studded with the first defiant stars of the night. The sun had set. He had been out for hours. He sat up, a groan escaping his lips. He expected to feel something. A lingering ache, a phantom burn, sickness. He felt nothing. In fact, he felt better than nothing. The screaming exhaustion in his muscles was gone. The dull ache in his back from his posture had vanished. The small cuts on his hands didn't sting. He felt clean. Efficient. His eyes shot down to his left arm, his heart hammering against his ribs in a panicked staccato. He braced himself for a mangled, blackened limb, a testament to the horror he'd endured. There was nothing. His skin was pale and unblemished, dotted with his usual smattering of freckles. There was no wound, no scar, no shimmering gel, no black veins. It was just his arm, exactly as it had been before, maybe even healthier. If not for the torn sleeve of his sweatshirt and the vivid, traumatic memory, he would have thought he'd imagined the entire thing. He flexed his fingers. The movement felt smooth, frictionless. He made a fist, and it felt stronger, more solid than it had any right to be. He pushed himself to his feet. His body, which had been on the verge of collapse earlier, now felt light and energized. The change was profound and deeply unsettling. That's when the second strange thing happened. A low, constant hum resonated at the base of his skull. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a new layer of perception he never had before. With it came a stream of quiet, clinical information, scrolling through the back of his mind like a computer's diagnostic report. Host status, online. Vitals stable. Heart rate, 78 BPM. Respiration, 16 breaths/min. Core temperature, 37.0 degrees Celsius. Analysis. Ambient air composition: nitrogen 78%, oxygen 21%, argon 0.9%. Izuku froze, his blood turning to ice. He looked at his own hand, turning it over and over. As he focused on it, the data stream shifted. Subject, host's left hand. Cellular composition: epidermal cells, melanocytes, dermal fibroblasts. Bone density, nominal. Tendon elasticity, optimal. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. No, no, no. What is this? Am I going crazy? He whispered, his voice hoarse. Was this a dream? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion and a concussion from falling? He slapped his own face. This thing was real. The data stream was real. The feeling of being a passenger in his own body was horrifyingly real. A flutter of movement at the edge of his vision caught his attention. A lone seagull, bold and weathered, landed on a nearby pile of tires. It cocked its head, its beady black eye fixing on him. It let out a sharp, cawing cry. Normally Izuku would have ignored it. But now, as his eyes met the birds, the hum in his head intensified. The data stream flickered and changed targets. Biological entity detected. Classification: Aves. Order: Charadriiformes. Family: Laridae. Species: Larus canis. Initiating external biological analysis. Physiology: hollow bone structure for reduced weight. Powerful pectoral muscles anchored to a prominent keel. Advanced respiratory system with air sacs for efficient oxygen uptake. Sensory data: tetrachromatic vision. Ability to perceive ultraviolet spectrum. The information wasn't just words in his head. As he read hollow bone structure, he felt a phantom lightness in his own skeleton, a bizarre and disturbing echo of the bird's anatomy. When the data mentioned powerful pectoral muscles, he felt a ghost of a sensation in his chest, a twitch of muscles he didn't possess. This was too much. He scrambled backward, away from the bird, away from the junk pile, away from the offending cylinder which now lay half buried in the sand, looking inert and harmless. He turned and ran. His flight was clumsy at first, his legs tangled with fear. But then something shifted. The analytical presence in his mind seemed to take note of his panic. Host locomotion, inefficient. High energy expenditure. Recommendation: optimize stride and posture. Without his conscious input, his body adjusted. His back straightened. His stride lengthened. The frantic pumping of his arms smoothed into a more rhythmic, energy-conserving swing. He was running faster than he ever had in his life, and it felt almost effortless. The burning in his lungs that usually accompanied any sprint was absent. The world flew by in a blur of terrifying clarity. He didn't stop until the familiar, brightly lit streets of his neighborhood came into view. He slowed to a walk, his breath barely labored, his heart beating a strong, steady rhythm that was dutifully reported in the corner of his mind's eye. Heart rate, 112 BPM. Decreasing. The walk to his apartment building was a torturous exercise in sensory overload. Every passing civilian was a potential data bomb. A woman walking her poodle flooded his mind with unwanted information on canine musculature and the olfactory receptors of a dog's nose. A man with a prominent mole on his cheek triggered an analysis of benign melanocytic nevi. The trees lining the street offered up data on photosynthesis and xylem tubes. It was a nightmare. A constant, invasive stream of information about the living world around him, all filtered through a cold, detached lens. He felt like one of his own analysis notebooks, but the analysis was happening to him, inside him, without his permission. He stumbled to a halt in front of his apartment door. Apartment 402. A simple, mundane door that represented everything normal and safe in his life. Behind it was his mother. Behind it was his room, with his all-might posters and his hero notebooks. Behind it was the life of Izuku Midoriya, the quirkless, dreaming boy. He lifted a trembling hand to the doorknob. Was he still that boy? The entity, the thing, inside him was silent, but its presence was a palpable weight in his soul. It had healed him, optimized him, and violated the sanctity of his own mind. It had given him something. It wasn't the bright, glorious quirk he had spent his entire life praying for. It wasn't pyrokinesis or super strength. It was a monstrous, clinical, parasitic awareness. But it was power. A terrifying, world-altering thought bloomed in the fertile soil of his desperation. He wasn't quirkless anymore. The data stream in his head offered one last, unsolicited piece of information as his fingers brushed against the cold metal of the doorknob. Host emotional state, fear 68%. Anxiety 25%. Hope 7%. That 7%, that tiny, defiant sliver of hope, was the most terrifying part of it all. It was the part that wondered if this nightmare could, somehow, still be a dream come true. With a deep, shuddering breath, Izuku Midoriya, the boy who was no longer just a boy, turned the knob and opened the door, stepping out of the twilight and into the light of his old life, forever changed. The smell of ginger and soy sauce was the first thing to greet him, a warm, familiar shield against the cold, alien presence that had taken root in his soul. Inko Midoriya, a whirlwind of loving anxiety, met him at the door, her face etched with worry that melted into relief the moment she saw him. Izuku! Oh, thank goodness, I was starting to get so worried. It's nearly 9 o'clock. She bustled around him, her hands fluttering near his shoulders but not quite touching, as if sensing the invisible do not disturb sign his entire being was screaming. Are you okay? You look pale. Did you overdo it again at that beach? I keep telling you, you need to be careful. All that rusted metal is a tetanus shot waiting to happen. Each word was a pinprick of guilt. How could he possibly explain? Sorry I'm late, Mom. I was unconscious for several hours after being forcibly bonded to a semi-sentient genetic bioweapon from a defunct and unethical corporation. The thought was so hysterically absurd that a bubble of manic laughter almost escaped him. He choked it down, forcing a weak, wobbly smile that felt like a foreign expression on his face. I'm okay, Mom. Just lost track of time. Found a really big pile of stuff to sort through. The lie was flimsy, but it was the only armor he had. As she ushered him towards the dining table where a steaming bowl of his favorite katsudon awaited, the hum in his head, his unwanted passenger, flared to life. Analysis. Subject Iko Midoriya. Genetic relationship. Mother 50% genome match. Emotional state. Anxiety, relief, affection. Physiological status. Elevated heart rate due to stress. Izuku flinched, squeezing his eyes shut for a second. The data was cold, intrusive, and deeply profane in this context. This was his mother, the single most important person in his life, and this thing was dissecting her like a lab specimen. He shoved the information down, trying to build a mental wall against it, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. Izuku? Honey, are you sure you're all right? Inko's voice was soft with concern. She placed a hand on his forehead. You don't feel warm. External stimulus detected. Tactile contact. Temperature differential. -2.1 degrees Celsius. Host body is cooler than average. I'm fine, really, he said, a little too loudly. He pulled away gently and sat down at the table, grabbing his chopsticks with a hand that was unnervingly steady. The katsudon, his ultimate comfort food, sat before him. Its aroma filled his senses, but today, it was accompanied by a silent, scrolling text in his mind. Analysis, nutrient bowl. Composition, fried pork cutlet high protein, high lipid, egg protein, choline, rice complex carbohydrate, onion, soy-based sauce high sodium. Assessment, optimal source for host energy replenishment. Caloric demand is currently 215% above baseline due to ongoing system integration and recalibration. Directive, consume. The final word wasn't a suggestion. It was a command that resonated with a primal, gut-deep hunger he had never experienced. His stomach growled, not with the familiar pang of a missed meal, but with a demanding, cavernous emptiness. He picked up his chopsticks and began to eat, his movements precise and efficient. He didn't wolf it down like a starving animal, but each bite was deliberate, each chew methodical. He was refueling a machine. His mother watched him, a small, sad smile on her face. Well, at least you have your appetite. You've been working so hard, my sweet boy. He wanted to cry. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess the terror and the horrifying, nascent spark of excitement. He wanted her to wrap him in a hug and tell him it was all a bad dream, but he couldn't. This secret was a contamination zone. Bringing her into it would be unforgivably selfish, so he just ate, the silent data stream continuing to catalog the nutritional breakdown of his meal, while he nodded and offered one-word answers to her gentle questions about his day. The distance between them had never felt so vast. After finishing the meal in record time and washing his bowl with a mechanical swiftness, he retreated to the one place that had always been his sanctuary, his room. He closed the door, the soft click of the latch sounding like a vault door sealing him in. The room was a shrine to a dream he now suspected was dead, replaced by something far stranger. All Might was everywhere. Posters of the symbol of peace in a dozen heroic poses adorned the walls. His iconic, toothy grin beamed from figurines on his shelves. His booming laugh echoed from the alarm clock on his nightstand. It was the pantheon of a faith he had held since he was 4 years old. Tonight it felt different. The heroic smiles seemed to mock him. All Might represented a clear, bright, noble path to heroism. A path paved with a righteous quirk and an indomitable will. What Izuku had acquired in the filth of Dagoba Beach felt unclean. It was a power born of shadow and secrecy, a body-snatching horror that analyzed his own mother like a slab of meat. He sank onto his desk chair, the familiar squeak a small comfort in the roaring silence of his mind. The hum was still there, a low-level background process. Host status, sedentary, initiating energy conservation mode. Shut up, he whispered to the empty room. The hum remained, indifferent to his command. He looked at his desk. On one side was his beloved stack of notebooks. Hero analysis for the future, no. 13-foot was on top, its pages filled with his spidery handwriting and detailed sketches of heroes, their quirks, their support gear, their strengths and weaknesses. It was the work of a hopeful, obsessive boy. His eyes drifted to the other side of the desk, to a fresh, untouched notebook he'd bought for school. It was plain black, with a simple spiral binding. An empty vessel. With a trembling hand, he picked it up, along with a pen. He opened it to the first page. The crisp white lines stared back at him, a blank slate. For a moment, he instinctively started to write hero analysis for the future, number 14. His pen hovered over the paper. No. That wasn't right. This wasn't for the future he had envisioned. This was for the now. This was for survival. He crossed out the words, the black ink a scar on the clean page. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind one takes before plunging into icy water. Then, in shaky, determined letters, he wrote a new title, Analysis of My Anomaly. Volume 1. The word felt right. Anomaly. A deviation from the standard, the normal, the expected. That's what he was now. He stared at the words, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm that was immediately and unhelpfully quantified in his mind's eye. Heart rate, 105 BPM. Stress hormone levels rising. He ignored it. He had to. He clicked his pen, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. If he couldn't control this thing, if he couldn't turn it off, then he had to do the only other thing he knew how, analyze it. Understand it. Break it down into its component parts until it was no longer a monster in the dark, but a problem with a set of rules. Hypothesis 1, he wrote, his handwriting becoming firmer, more clinical. The entity, let's call it Genesis for now, based on the container, is a symbiotic life form composed of adaptive genetic material. It has integrated with my body on a cellular level. Observation 1a, Genesis is semi-sentient. It can process data, identify threats, and issue directives, but does not appear to possess personality or complex consciousness yet. Its communication is purely data-based. Observation 1b, it seems to have a prime directive, host survival and optimization. It healed my prior injuries, purged toxins, and appears to be managing my body's energy consumption. He paused, chewing on the end of his pen. The next part was harder to write, harder to admit. Hypothesis 2, Genesis can analyze the biological data of other life forms through proximity and/or observation. Hypothesis 3, it may be possible to replicate the biological traits it analyzes. This was the terrifying, thrilling core of it. The memory of the phantom lightness in his bones when he looked at the seagull was still fresh. Could he actually use that data? Could he manifest those traits? The idea was straight out of a sci-fi horror movie. It was body horror of the highest degree. It was also, potentially, a quirk. A versatile, powerful, incredible quirk. His fear and his desperate, all-consuming desire to be a hero were at war within him. For a moment, the fear was winning. What if he tried something and couldn't change back? What if he turned into some grotesque, half-formed monster? What if the pain of the bonding was a prelude to the agony of every transformation? But then, the alternative whispered in his ear. The alternative was to do nothing. To remain quirkless as Zucchamidaria, with a terrifying parasite living in his head, forever a spectator. That was a fate worse than any pain. He needed a test subject. Something small, simple, and readily available. His eyes scanned his room, past the all-might figures, past the stacks of manga. They landed on a dark corner of his ceiling, where a tiny, spindly spider was patiently tending to its web. A common house spider. Parasteatoda tepidariorum. The name appeared in his head, unbidden, the moment he focused on it. Biological entity detected. Classification, Arachnida. Order, Araneae. Species, Parasteatoda tepidariorum. Initiating external biological analysis. Physiology, exoskeleton composed of chitin. 8 simple eyes ocelli. Ventral spinnerets for silk production. Notable trait, tarsal claws and seedy on legs for adhesion to surfaces via van der Waals forces. The data flowed, cool and precise. Van der Waals forces. Microscopic hairs creating an intermolecular bond. That's how they walked on walls. The concept, once an abstract bit of trivia from a science textbook, was now a tangible, visceral piece of information. He could almost feel the physics of it. Okay. Here we go. He stood up, his mouth dry. He looked from the spider to the wall next to his desk. He took a deep breath. Focus. He thought, trying to direct the formless hum of Genesis. Adhesion. The CD. On my fingers. Replicated. For a moment, nothing happened. He felt foolish, standing in his room, staring at a spider and trying to will his hands to be sticky. He felt a surge of disappointment. Maybe he'd imagined it all. Then, he felt a tingle. It started at his fingertips, a strange, prickling sensation, like the feeling of a limb waking up after falling asleep, but 1,000 times more intense. It wasn't painful, not yet, but it was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He looked down at his right hand. To the naked eye, it looked the same. But the data stream in his head told a different story. Manifestation protocol initiated. Target trait, CD adhesion. Host epidermal cells on fingertips are restructuring. Rapid, controlled keratin production is forming microscopic bristles. Energy cost, moderate. Host calorie reserves are being utilized. The tingling intensified, becoming a strange, crawling itch that felt like it was coming from inside the skin. He had the horrifying mental image of millions of tiny hairs pushing their way out of his pores. He fought down a wave of nausea. Keep going. You have to know. He reached out a trembling hand and pressed his fingertips against the painted drywall of his bedroom wall. They stuck. His eyes widened in sheer disbelief. It wasn't like glue. There was no tackiness. It was a clean, solid connection. He let go of the pressure, and his hand remained, affixed to the vertical surface. He cautiously put a little weight on it, leaning forward. His fingers held fast. He was sticking to the wall. Just like the spider. He did it. He actually did it. A giddy, triumphant laugh escaped his lips. It was real. This was real. The potential, the sheer, boundless potential of it all crashed down on him. The world of quirks had just opened up to him in the most bizarre way imaginable. He could copy abilities. He could adapt. The triumph was cut short by a new sensation. A sharp, stinging pain was blooming in his fingertips, and the data stream flashed a new, urgent message. Warning, structural integrity of manifestation is failing. Host cellular structure is unaccustomed to the transformation. Cellular degradation imminent. Recommendation, cease manifestation. The pain spiked. The pleasant tingle had become a feeling of 1,000 paper cuts doused in lemon juice. He gasped and instinctively tried to pull his hand away. It was a mistake. The seedy, the microscopic bristles, were still interlocked with the wall's surface. Pulling away felt like trying to rip off a strip of Velcro that had been surgically grafted to his skin. A sharp, tearing agony shot up his arm. "Ah!" he yelped, biting his lip to keep from shouting. "Don't pull, let go!" A part of his mind, his own analytical part, not Genesis, screamed. "You have to will it to stop." He closed his eyes, focusing through the pain. Stop. Recede. Go back to normal. He pictured his normal fingertips, the familiar whirls of his fingerprints. The retraction was even worse than the manifestation. It felt like 1,000 tiny fishhooks were being ripped out of his pores all at once. The pain was sharp, exquisite, and utterly sickening. He fell back onto his chair with a cry, clutching his hand to his chest. His fingertips were bright red, inflamed, and screaming with pain as if he'd pressed them against a hot stove. Manifestation ceased. Tissue damage detected in fingertips. Initiating minor repair protocol. A cool, soothing sensation began to spread through his fingers, dulling the worst of the ache. The pain subsided, but the memory of it, and the lesson, remained. He sat there for a long time, breathing heavily, his heart pounding. He looked at his red, tender fingertips, then at the small, unassuming spider on the ceiling, completely oblivious to the trauma it had just indirectly caused. He had power. But it came at a price. A painful, physical price. He wasn't just copying an ability. He was forcing his human biology to twist and contort into something it was never meant to be. He picked up his pen again, his hand shaking slightly. Result of Test 1: Spider adhesion, successful. Partial manifestation of CD on fingertips allowed for adhesion to a vertical surface for approximately 7 seconds. Manifestation is physically taxing and requires intense concentration. Retraction is involuntary when structural integrity fails, and is extremely painful if resisted. Conclusion: this can't be reckless. Every transformation is a physical trauma. I need to understand the rules. The limits. The cost. The weekend became his laboratory. His mother, bless her heart, attributed his sudden reclusiveness and voracious appetite to a teenage growth spurt and studying for high school entrance exams. It was the perfect cover. He spent hours outside ostensibly getting fresh air, but in reality, he was a scientist on a field expedition, and his own body was the unexplored continent. He needed more data points. He started a new section in his notebook, Trial and Error, defining the rules of adaptation. Test Subject 2, Neighborhood Cat Species, Felis catus. He found one lounging on a garden wall, a fluffy calico that regarded him with lazy, green eyes. He sat on a nearby bench, pretending to read, and focused. He didn't want claws or agility. He wanted its eyes, the way they could see in the dark. Analysis: sensory organ feline eye. Notable trait: tapetum lucidum, a retroreflective tissue layer. High concentration of rod cells. Vertical slit pupil for superior light control. Just the pupil, he thought, focusing with all his might. Replicate the light control. He felt a strange, painless pulling sensation at the center of his vision. He took out the small compact mirror he'd borrowed from his mother's purse. He angled it to look at his own eye. His jaw dropped. His normally round, green pupil had constricted into a thin, vertical black slit, just like the cat's. The world took on a strange, hyper-sharp quality, color seeming both muted and more distinct at the same time. The hum of Genesis seemed to purr with satisfaction. Manifestation stable. He held it for a full minute before the familiar strain began, a dull headache building behind his eyes. He carefully willed the transformation to recede. This time, the reversal was less painful, just a strange disorientation as his pupil dilated back to its normal shape and the world swam back into its usual focus. He was left with a headache and a sense of profound wonder. Rule 1: observation is sufficient. He wrote in his notebook. Direct physical contact is not always necessary, but proximity seems to help. The more complex the desired trait, the more focus is required. Test Subject 3, Shiba Inu species, Canis lupus familiaris, A man was walking a cheerful, energetic Shiba Inu in the park. Izuku sat on a bench as they passed, focusing not on its form, but on its primary sense, smell. Analysis. Sensory organ canine olfactory system. 300 million olfactory receptors compared to host 6 million. Vomeronasal organ for pheromone detection. Give me that, he thought, bracing himself. Just for a second, the world exploded. It wasn't a smell. It was a tidal wave of information that crashed into his brain. It was a fire hose of scent. He could smell the faintest trace of the hot dogs from a vendor 3 blocks away. He could smell the specific blend of shampoo used by a woman 20 feet away. He could smell the ozone from the train tracks, the chlorophyll from every individual blade of grass, the faint, coppery scent of old blood on a child's scraped knee from an hour ago. It was too much. It was a cacophony of odors, a billion different voices screaming for his attention. Sensory overload. Host neural pathways are not equipped to process this volume of data. He gagged, stumbling to his feet and clamping his hands over his nose, a useless gesture. The smells permeated everything. He desperately focused on reversing the change, his head spinning. The sensory onslaught mercifully receded, leaving him dizzy, nauseous, and with the ghost of 1,000 scents clinging to the inside of his nostrils. He collapsed onto the bench, scribbling furiously in his notebook with a shaky hand. Rule 2. Adaptation is temporary and physically/mentally taxing. Overloading a sense is just as dangerous as physical transformation. I am still limited by my human brain's ability to process the new input. Test subject 4. Japanese rhinoceros beetle species, Alomarina dichotoma. He found one crawling on a tree. It was a beautiful insect, its exoskeleton a deep, polished mahogany. It was sturdy. Armored. Analysis. Exoskeleton. Composition. Chitin and sclerotin protein layers. Provides structural support and protection. This was a more practical test. Not a sense, but defense. He focused on the back of his left hand, the one that hadn't been traumatized by the wall experiment. Carapace. Harden the skin. Replicate the exoskeleton. This transformation was different. It was a tightening, a pulling sensation as if his skin was shrinking. He watched, fascinated and horrified, as the skin on the back of his hand lost its soft, fleshy texture. It darkened slightly, taking on a faint, brownish sheen, and became hard and smooth to the touch. He tapped it with the fingernail of his other hand. It made a sharp, plastic-like click. He had given himself armor, manifestation stable. Durability increased by 400% in affected area. Flexibility reduced by 75%. He tried to make a fist. The new, hardened skin was inflexible. It pulled taut and resisted the movement. He pushed it, trying to force his knuckles to bend. A thin, white line appeared on the surface of the armor. Then, with a sickening crack like thin plastic breaking, a fissure appeared. It didn't hurt. The nerves were underneath. But the sight of his own skin cracking was profoundly disturbing. He immediately reversed the process, the hardened layer flaking away like a sunburn, revealing the normal, pale skin beneath. Rule 3. Direct biological mimicry has flaws. He wrote, his mind racing. A beetle's armor works because its entire joint structure is designed for it. Grafting it onto a human hand creates a brittle, inflexible plate. I don't just need to copy the trait. I need Genesis to intelligently adapt it to my own physiology. That will be harder. More complex. Over the weekend, Genesis's communication began to evolve, too. It was learning from him, from his reactions and his needs. The raw data stream started to be accompanied by simple, bracketed labels, a shorthand it was developing to be more useful to its host. When his stomach rumbled during the long analysis session, the data stream for a nearby apple was appended with nutrient source. When a truck backfired down the street, making him jump, Genesis flared with sudden auditory event, potential threat? The question mark was new. It was learning to query his emotional state, to cross-reference data with his own fear response. A feedback loop was forming. His curiosity directed Genesis to analyze, and Genesis's analysis provided him with options, which in turn fueled his curiosity. They were, in a terrifying and exhilarating way, learning together. By Sunday night, His notebook was filled with a dozen pages of frantic scribbles, diagrams, and hastily written rules. He had a rudimentary catalogue of what he could do, and a healthy fear of the consequences. He had managed a cat's night vision, a dog's sense of smell, a spider's grip, and a beetle's armor. All were temporary, all were draining, and all were imperfect. But they were his. He stood in front of the mirror in his room. He saw the same old Izuku Midoriya staring back. A slightly too short boy with a wild mop of green-black hair and a face full of freckles. A face that people looked at and saw quirkless. Useless. Deku. But the reflection was a lie. Beneath that familiar, unassuming skin was a biological marvel, a living genome capable of rewriting itself on the fly. Inside his head was a silent co-pilot, a database of every living thing he could observe. He was a chimera. A monster. A miracle. He reached over to his desk and picked up the folded piece of paper he kept tucked away in a drawer. It was his official quirk registration, or lack thereof. It was a medical form, detailing the extra joint in his pinky toe, the doctor's clinical diagnosis that he was part of the unlucky minority. For 10 years, that piece of paper had been his reality, a death certificate for his dreams. He looked from the paper to his new black notebook, analysis of my anomaly. One was a declaration of his limits. The other was a record of him shattering them. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach. The body horror was real. The pain was real. But for the first time since he was 4 years old, the hope was real, too. It was no longer a distant, childish fantasy pinned on the idea that he might spontaneously develop a quirk, or that a hero might see something in him. It was a concrete, tangible power that was his to command, to understand, and to master. The boy in the mirror didn't look like a hero. Not yet. But he no longer looked like a victim, either. He looked like a scientist who had just discovered a new, volatile element. He looked like an explorer who had just found a map to a new world. He clenched his right hand into a fist. He could feel the hum of Genesis, silent and waiting. It was a part of him now. The terror of that fact was slowly, surely, being eclipsed by the thrill. He was not quirkless. He was something else entirely. And he would use it. He would tame this monster inside him and ride it all the way to his dream. Host emotional state, fear 20%. Determination 75%. Excitement 5%. Assessment, host is adapting to new reality. Positive outcome. Izuku allowed a small, sharp smile to grace his lips. It wasn't the beaming, confident smile of all might. It was the smile of someone who had stared into the abyss and found a weapon waiting for him there. Okay, he whispered to his reflection, and to the silent partner within. Let's get to work. The final bell of Aldera Junior High was less a sound of liberation and more the starting pistol for a daily race. For most students, it was a race to arcades, to friends, to the freedom of the afternoon. For Izuku Midoriya, it was a race to obscurity. His path home was a carefully calculated route of back alleys and less traveled streets. A strategic retreat designed to minimize his chances of encountering Katsuki Bakugo and his sycophantic lieutenants. These past few weeks, however, the dynamic had shifted. The fear that usually coiled in his gut during these post-school journeys was still present, but it was now accompanied by a strange, detached layer of analysis, courtesy of the passenger in his head. Identified associates of Kaken. Probability of hostile interaction, 47%. Recommended evasive maneuver, alter route via Kinoshita Market Alley. Izuku had learned to heed these silent suggestions. Genesis, as he named the entity, was a phenomenal threat assessment engine. It didn't feel fear, it calculated risk. As he walked, he idly focused on a pigeon pecking at a discarded rice ball. Biological entity, Columba livia domestica. Notable trait, magnetoreception. Ability to perceive Earth's magnetic field for navigational purposes. He quickly broke his focus before the influx of sensory data could give him a headache. He was getting better at filtering the constant stream of information, at building mental walls to keep Genesis from analyzing every single person he passed. But it was exhausting, like constantly tensing a muscle he never knew he had. He was so engrossed in his internal management that he didn't hear the heavy, familiar footsteps approaching from behind until a hand clamped down on his shoulder. "Oh, Deku!" Izuku froze. The voice was unmistakable, a blend of gravel and contempt that had been the soundtrack to his misery for a decade. He turned slowly to face Katsuki Bakugo, flanked by his two usual cronies. Threat detected. Kaken. Hostile intent probability, 89%. Adrenal response initiated. Izuku's heart rate spiked, a fact his internal co-pilot duly noted. Bakugo's crimson eyes narrowed, scanning Izuku from head to toe. There was a new, unsettling quality to his glare. The usual outright disdain was still there, but it was now tainted with confusion, like a predator trying to understand why its prey was suddenly behaving differently. "You've been weird lately," Bakugo grunted, his hand tightening on Izuku's shoulder. His palm let off a series of tiny, intimidating crackles, like popping candy made of nitroglycerin. "Been slinking around even more than usual. And you smell different." Izuku's blood ran cold. He can smell it? Of course he could. After the experiment with the dog's olfactory senses, Izuku had become hyper-aware of his own scent. The subtle, almost imperceptible chemical changes from Genesis's constant biological tinkering, the faint ozone tang that sometimes clung to him after a painful manifestation, a normal person wouldn't notice, but Bakugo's senses had always been unnaturally sharp. "I don't know what you're talking about, Kaken," Izuku stammered, falling back on old habits. "Don't lie to me!" Bakugo snarled, shoving him back against the concrete wall of an underpass. "You think I'm stupid? You stopped muttering all that creepy hero crap. You don't flinch the same way. What's your deal, huh? Finally accepted you're a useless pebble on the side of the road?" The insult, which would have crippled him a month ago, now landed with a strange lack of impact. Useless? Pebble? His mind, now augmented by cold logic, processed the words not as a personal failing, but as an inaccurate assessment based on incomplete data. Statement: useless pebble. Analysis: false. Host possesses unique adaptive biological capabilities. Subject: Kaken is operating on outdated information. The silent, clinical defense from Genesis was so bizarrely comforting that Izuku almost let a smile slip. He caught himself, schooling his features into the familiar mask of fear. It wouldn't do to provoke Bakugo further. Not yet. Not until he understood his own power better. "And nothing's different," Izuku insisted. Bakugo stared at him for a long, tense moment, searching his face. He seemed to find nothing but the same old pathetic Deku and grunted in disgust. "TCH, whatever. Stay out of my way, you damn nerd." He released Izuku's shoulder with a final, contemptuous shove and stalked off, his cronies trailing in his wake. Izuku sagged against the cool concrete of the underpass, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The confrontation had drained him. Threat level decreased. Adrenal levels receding. The clinical updates were, for once, a welcome relief. He took a moment to compose himself, the damp, cool air of the underpass a balm on his frayed nerves. He kicked a discarded plastic bottle on the ground, the sound echoing in the enclosed space. He needed to get home. He needed to update his notebook. He had learned something new. His own body chemistry was changing in ways others could potentially detect. Another variable to control. As he bent down to pick up his yellow backpack, a sickening, gurgling sound echoed from the sewer grate just a few feet away. It sounded like a clogged drain trying to clear itself, a wet, viscous noise that made the hair on his arms stand up. Auditory anomaly detected. Source: subconcrete sewage system. Analysis: rapid displacement of liquid mass. Unnatural. Before Izuku could even process the warning, the heavy iron grate flew into the air as if shot from a cannon. A monstrous tidal wave of green, putrid sludge erupted from the manhole, surging upwards to form a grotesque, towering shape. Two enormous, manic eyes bobbed in the semi-liquid mass, along with a horrifyingly wide mouth filled with yellowing, scattered teeth. "A medium-sized invisibility cloak," the creature gurgled, its voice thick and sloshing. Its eyes fixed on Izuku, the only living thing in the underpass. "Perfect. You'll do just fine." Izuku was paralyzed. Pure, unadulterated terror, the likes of which he hadn't felt since the moment of his bonding with Genesis, seized him. His brain screamed at him to run, to scream, to do something, but his limbs were locked in place. Imminent threat. Host in mortal danger. Classification, amorphous biological entity. Hostile intent, 100%. The sludge villain lunged. It was impossibly fast, a living tsunami of filth. It crashed over Izuku, and the world dissolved into a suffocating, green-brown nightmare. It was worse than drowning. The sludge was thick, heavy, and invasive, forcing its way into his mouth, his nose, his ears. It was cold and smelled of raw sewage and decay. He clawed at it, but his hands just passed through the viscous body, finding no purchase. Don't worry, I'm just taking over your body. It'll be easier for both of us if you don't fight back. The villain's voice echoed, muffled, from all around him. It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds. Izuku's lungs were on fire. Black spots danced in his vision. This was it. This was how he died. Drowning in garbage in a lonely underpass, his dreams, his secrets, his entire anomalous existence snuffed out before it ever had a chance to matter. Warning! Asphyxiation imminent. Oxygen levels critical. Host life signs failing. Genesis was screaming in his mind, its calm, clinical tone replaced with a frantic series of red flag alerts. Initiating emergency protocol. Searching biological catalog for solution. Desperate, dying, Izuku's last conscious thought wasn't of heroism. It was of his mother. I'm sorry. Have no fear, for I am here. The voice, a thunderclap of pure heroism, ripped through the suffocating silence. The pressure around Izuku vanished. A hurricane of wind tore the sludge villain apart, sending gobbets of green slime splattering against the underpass walls. Izuku collapsed onto the pavement, gasping, coughing, vomiting up a mixture of bile and filth. He looked up, his vision blurry with tears and sludge. There, silhouetted against the light at the end of the tunnel, was a mountain of muscle and charisma. The iconic V-shaped hair antennae, the impossible smile, All Might. The hero was already scooping the scattered remains of the villain into a pair of large soda bottles. He moved with an efficiency that was breathtaking, each movement precise and powerful. Ah, you're all right. Apologies. I was hot on this fellow's tail, but he gave me the slip in the sewer system. It's not every day I make a mistake like that. All Might boomed, his voice echoing with cheer that seemed to physically push back the darkness. He capped the bottles and gave Izuku a thumbs up. But all's well that ends well. Thank you for your unwitting assistance. Izuku was starstruck. His near-death experience was completely eclipsed by the reality of his idol standing just feet away. The #1 hero. In the flesh, he scrambled for his notebook, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it. All Might. See, can you sign my notebook? He stammered out, bowing repeatedly. All Might let out a hearty laugh. Of course. Anything for a fan. He took the notebook and, with a flourish, scrawled a massive, dynamic signature across 2 whole pages. There you go. Well, I must be off and deliver this scoundrel to the authorities. Stay safe, citizen. Wait! Izuku cried out, a desperate urgency seizing him. This was it. This was his one chance. The question that had burned in his heart for a decade. Can someone without a quirk, can they still be a hero like you? All Might paused, his back to Izuku. For a moment, the heroic posture seemed to sag. He looked over his shoulder, his ever-present smile looking a little strained. It's a noble dream, young man, but heroism is a dangerous line of work. Pro heroes risk their lives every day. Without a quirk, you'd be a liability. It's good to have dreams, but you have to make sure they're realistic. He gave Izuku a small, apologetic look. If you want to help people, you could always become a police officer. They do fine work, even if they're often looked down upon. The words were a physical blow. Worse than the sludge. Worse than Bakugo's explosions. They were the final nail in the coffin of his childhood dream, hammered in by the one person he'd hoped would pry it open. Now I really must fly. All Might crouched, muscles tensing for a launch. Stand back. In a moment of pure, idiotic desperation that he would later be unable to explain, Izuku did the exact opposite. As All Might shot into the air, Izuku lunged and grabbed onto his leg, The world became a screaming vortex of wind. The force threatened to tear his arms from their sockets. All Might, shocked, tried to shake him off before realizing he was hundreds of feet in the air. He landed clumsily on the roof of a nearby department store, coughing. Izuku collapsed, his mind a whirlwind of shame and panic. "I'm so sorry! I had so many more questions." All Might looked at him, and for a terrifying second, the hero's form seemed to flicker. Then, steam began to pour from his body, and in a grotesque implosion of muscle, the symbol of peace deflated into a skeletal, gaunt man with sunken eyes and a mop of blonde hair. A trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. Izuku could only stare in abject horror as the man, Toshinori Yagi, explained the truth. The injury. The time limit. The frail reality behind the invincible smile. The symbol of peace was a flickering candle in the wind, and then Izuku noticed it. The empty pockets on Toshinori's cargo pants. The bottles, Izuku whispered, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening realization. "Where's the villain?" Toshinori's eyes widened in horror. He patted his pockets frantically. They were gone. They must have fallen during their impromptu flight. An explosion ripped through the air from a few blocks away, followed by a chorus of panic screams. The two of them, the broken hero and the broken-hearted boy, stared in the direction of the chaos, united in a moment of shared, terrible understanding. By the time Izuku got down from the roof and sprinted to the scene, the chaos was in full swing. A shopping arcade was on fire. A crowd of onlookers was held back by police, their phones held high to capture the disaster. A cadre of heroes was already there, but they were utterly ineffective. Kamui Woods, the popular wood-based hero, was evacuating civilians, unable to get close to the inferno. "I can't do anything. He's all fluid, and this fire is everywhere. My branches would just burn up." The rookie hero Empty Lady was there too, but she was useless. "I can't get down that alley. I do more damage than him." And Death Arms, the powerhouse, was punching futilely at the swirling mass of sludge, his blows doing nothing to the amorphous villain. "Damn it! I can't get a grip on him." Then Izuku saw him. At the epicenter of the swirling vortex of filth and explosions was a thrashing, furious figure. Katsuki Bakugo. The sludge villain had found a new, far more powerful host. Bakugo was fighting, detonating blast after blast within the villain's body, but each explosion only served to spread more fire and chaos. His face, visible for a brief, horrifying moment, was a mask of sheer terror and apoplectic rage. His mouth was covered. He was suffocating. His eyes, wide and panicked, locked with Izuku's for a split second across the sea of fire and people. And in that second, something inside Izuku snapped. It wasn't a thought. It was a primal, seismic shift in his being. The doctor's words, All Might's words, his own decade of ingrained fear and inadequacy, it all evaporated. All that was left was the sight of someone in mortal danger. The sight of Kaken, his childhood friend, his tormentor, drowning on dry land. His feet moved before his brain could issue the command. He burst through the police line. The heroes yelled at him. "Hey! Kid! Stop! It's too dangerous!" But he couldn't stop. His legs were no longer his own. They belonged to a purpose he was only just beginning to understand. And as he ran, as the heat of the fire washed over his face, the silent partner in his mind roared to life. It didn't offer suggestions this time. It took command. Critical threat detected. Host's primary social associate Kaken in mortal danger. Cause asphyxiation via villain sludge. Host is now in direct danger. Environmental hazards, fire, explosions, debris. Objective, neutralize threat. Preserve associate's life. Preserve host's life. Initiating combat adaptation protocol. Accessing catalog. A cascade of data flooded Izuku's mind, not as suggestions, but as executable commands. Biological data, mud skipper parathymus. Trait, percutaneous respiration. Ability to breathe through moist skin. Highly effective in low oxygen, high moisture environments. Execute? Yes. Izuku's frantic mind screamed. Executing. A bizarre, tingling sensation spread across his entire body. It was far more intense than any of his previous experiments. It felt like his skin was dissolving and reforming all at once. A thin, shimmering layer of mucus, cool and slick, coated his exposed skin. His pores opened, and as he ran into the thick, smoky air, he took a breath not just with his lungs, but with his entire body. The air was still foul, still hot, but the suffocating quality was gone. He could breathe. It was a grotesque miracle. He was closing the distance. The sludge villain turned its attention to him. Not you again! I'll kill you this time! Izuku didn't slow down. He swung his bright yellow backpack off his shoulder and hurled it with all his might. The bag, full of heavy textbooks, flew through the air and smacked the villain directly in its right eye. It was a perfect shot, a desperate ploy that he hadn't even consciously planned. The villain roared in pain and surprise, its grip on Bakugo loosening for a fraction of a second. Opportunity detected. Host is within melee range. Offensive capabilities required. Biological data. Japanese rhinoceros beetle Alomarina dichotoma. Trait, chitinous carapace. High durability, moderate striking power. Execute? Yes. Now, executing. The skin over his knuckles and the back of his hands pulled taut. A sickening cracking sound, audible even over the roar of the fire, emanated from his fists. The flesh darkened, hardened, and reformed, not into a simple plate like in his experiment, but into a series of overlapping, segmented pieces of dark, glistening chitin. Crude, jagged points formed over his knuckles. It was a biological brass knuckle, a primitive, horrifying gauntlet grown from his own cells. The transformation was agonizing, a feeling of his bones reshaping and his skin tearing, but the adrenaline and the sheer force of his will numbed the worst of it. He reached the villain. The creature, still reeling from the backpack to its eye, hadn't fully recovered. Izuku didn't throw a punch. He didn't know how to. Instead, acting on pure, animalistic instinct, he began to dig. He plunged his newly armored hands into the villain's slimy body, clawing, tearing, trying to reach Bakugo. The slime washed over him, but his skin-breathing adaptation held. He wasn't suffocating. His grotesquely armored hands gave him purchase in the sludge. He clawed at the villain's main eye, the one he had hit with his bag. The jagged points of chitin tore through the gelatinous surface, ripping it open. The villain screamed, a high-pitched, gurgling shriek of pure agony. Its entire body convulsed, and its grip on Bakugo slackened significantly. For the first time in nearly a minute, Bakugo's mouth was free. He took a massive, desperate gasp of air, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and utter, soul-shaking disbelief as he stared at the monstrous, slime-coated figure clawing him free. He saw the shimmering, mucus-covered skin. He saw the dark, insect-like armor covering the hands. He saw Deku's face, contorted in a mask of ferocious determination he had never seen before. This wasn't Deku. This was a monster. The crowd was stunned into silence. The heroes were frozen in place. They were witnessing something that defied all logic. A quirkless boy, or so they thought, had charged in and with some kind of horrific, instantaneous transformation quirk, had done more in 10 seconds than they had in 5 minutes. What? What is that kid's quirk? Someone in the crowd yelled. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The villain, enraged and wounded, reared back to crush Izuku. But it had hesitated for too long. Izuku's desperate, monstrous act of heroism had done more than just save Bakugo. It had shamed the number one hero into action. A shadow fell over them. I really am pathetic, a familiar, booming voice said, filled with a new and terrible self-loathing. All Might, in his full, muscular form, had arrived. He grabbed Izuku's and Bakugo's arms, pulling them free. I told you about the qualities that make a hero, but I wasn't living up to my own ideals. Pros are always ready to risk their lives. Detroit Smash. The punch wasn't aimed at the villain. It was aimed at the sky above it. The sheer air pressure was like a physical god hand striking the earth. The sludge villain was obliterated, its body atomized and scattered into a fine green mist. The resulting updraft was so powerful it extinguished the fires in the arcade and caused the clouds to part. It started to rain. In the sudden, quiet aftermath, there was only the sound of the rain and the collective, stunned gasp of hundreds of people. The aftermath was a blur. The pro-heroes, once they'd recovered from their shock, surrounded them. They praised Bakugo for his powerful quirk and his tenacity. They descended on Izuku with a barrage of harsh scolding. "Are you insane, kid? That was reckless vigilantism!" Death Arms yelled, his face stern. "Your quirk is clearly powerful, but it's dangerously unstable. You could have gotten yourself killed, or made things worse." Kamui Woods added, pointing a wooden finger at him. Izuku just stood there, trembling, as the adrenaline faded and the pain began to set in. The slimy mucus layer on his skin was already receding, leaving his skin feeling raw and scrubbed. The chitin on his hands cracked and flaked away like old scabs, revealing bruised, bleeding knuckles underneath. The transformations had taken a heavy toll. Bakugo was being fawned over, but his eyes never left Izuku. His face was a thunderous mask of confusion, humiliation, and a terrifying, unreadable new level of rage. Deku, useless, quirkless Deku, had saved him. And he had done it with a power that was disgusting, terrifying, and utterly alien. His entire worldview, a simple hierarchy with himself at the top and Deku at the bottom, had been shattered into a million pieces. Izuku, wanting nothing more than to disappear, turned and began to walk away, his head down, ignoring the reporters who were now trying to question him. He just wanted to go home. He wanted to collapse. "DKU!" He flinched, turning to see Bakugo storming towards him. He braced for an explosion, for a scream. Instead, Bakugo just stood in front of him, his fists clenched, his body trembling. "I didn't need your help," he snarled, his voice low and shaking. "I was fine. I had it handled. You didn't save me. You hear me? Don't you ever look down on me, you damn freak." With that, he turned and stalked away, leaving Izuku alone with the weight of his actions. He continued his walk home, the scolding of the heroes and Bakugo's venomous words echoing in his ears. He had been reckless. He had been stupid. But he had saved him. The two thoughts warred in his mind. "I am here!" The booming voice made him jump a foot in the air. All Might, in his heroic form, skidded to a halt in front of him. "All Might? What are you doing here? I thought you were swarmed by reporters. Getting away from them is nothing for me," the hero declared, though he seemed less boisterous than usual. "For I am All Might, Black." Suddenly, the hero deflated in a cloud of steam, reverting to the skeletal Tashinori Yagi, who coughed a worrying amount of blood into his hand. Izuku panicked. "All Might! Are you okay?" Fine. Tashinori wheezed, wiping his mouth. "Young man. I came to thank you, and to revise what I said earlier. And to scold you, of course." Izuku flinched, expecting another lecture on recklessness. "I told you that you couldn't be a hero without a quirk," Tashinori said, his voice quiet and serious. "It was a logical conclusion, based on the data I had. But I was wrong." He looked up, and his sunken eyes held a profound new light, a mixture of awe and intense curiosity. "Watching you run in, I saw that you had more than just a dream. You had the instinct. Your body moved before you had a chance to think. And that is the defining trait of all the greatest heroes." He took a step closer, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. "But that's not all I saw. I saw a scared kid, with no obvious quirk, suddenly able to breathe in that filth. I saw you grow something from your own hands to tear him apart. I saw you manifest powers on the fly, grotesquely, painfully, but effectively." Tashinori's voice dropped to a near whisper, filled with a gravity that made the air feel thick. He was no longer speaking as a hero to a fan. He was speaking as a mystery to an enigma. "I've seen thousands of quirks in my time, young man. Quirks that let people control fire, quirks that let them grow to the size of buildings, quirks that let them talk to animals. But I have never, ever seen anything like what you just did." He looked at Izuku, not at a boy, but at a living paradox. A biological anomaly walking in a teenager's body. The pity from their earlier encounter was gone, replaced by a deep, unnerving respect and a boundless curiosity. "So, forget what I said on that roof. And forget my question about whether you had a quirk or not. I have a new one." He leaned in, his gaze fixed on Izuku's, searching for the answer to a question that could change the world. "Young Midoriya, we need to talk. What is your quirk?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier and more potent than the residual smoke from Bakugo's explosions. "What is your quirk?" It wasn't a casual inquiry. It was a demand for an explanation of the impossible, delivered by the one man Izuku had idolized his entire life. The world seemed to shrink, the sounds of the city fading away until all that existed was the quiet street, the setting sun painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple, and the piercing, searching gaze of the skeletal man who was also the symbol of peace. Izuku's mouth opened, but no words came out. His mind, usually a whirlwind of frantic thought, was a complete and utter blank. How could he possibly answer that? Where would he even begin? "Well, you see, All Might, I was scavenging for scrap metal to build up my body because you told me I couldn't be a hero, and I accidentally ruptured a canister containing a top-secret, semi-sentient genetic bioweapon from the dawn of the Quirk era, and now it lives in my cells and lets me turn my hands into bug claws." The sheer, unadulterated insanity of it was overwhelming. His silence stretched, becoming more awkward with each passing second. Toshinori Yagi waited, his patience a palpable force. He wasn't looking at Izuku with the pity he'd shown on the roof, nor with the harsh judgment of the other pro-heroes. His expression was one of intense, scholarly fascination, like a biologist who had just discovered a new species that defied every known law of nature. Finally, Izuku's internal co-pilot, the ever-present Genesis, came to his rescue. It didn't offer a social strategy, but a torrent of pure data, a summary of his own recent, panicked analysis. The information flooded the forefront of his mind, and Izuku, falling back on his lifelong habit of analytical muttering, began to speak, his voice barely a whisper at first. I don't know," he began, the words tumbling out, clumsy and disorganized. "It's new. It's not a single thing. It's an entity. A presence. I call it Genesis. It analyzes, it catalogs biological information. Anything living. Plants, animals, insects, people." He looked up at Toshinori, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate need to be understood. "When I focus, or when I'm in danger, it lets me manifest traits from the things it's analyzed. Temporary. It's a physical transformation. The skin breathing, that was from a mud skipper I saw in a documentary. The hand armor, a rhinoceros beetle from the park." He gestured vaguely with his hands, which were still scraped and bruised from the chitinous transformation and retraction. "It's not perfect. It hurts. It's inefficient. My body isn't designed for it, so it forces the changes. It's like my body is the hardware, and Genesis is a constantly updating software that's not fully compatible. It causes errors, pain, damage." He was rambling, he knew it. He sounded like a madman. He braced himself for disbelief, for dismissal, for the look that said he was crazy. Instead, Toshinori's sunken eyes widened even further, a spark of something like wonder igniting within them. He didn't scoff. He leaned in closer, his expression rapt. "An analytical and adaptive symbiote." Toshinori breathed, the words barely audible. "Not just mimicry, but biological replication on a cellular level. Extraordinary." He looked at Izuku's hands, then back at his face. "You mean to tell me that a month ago, you were for all intents and purposes quirkless?" Izuku flinched at the word but nodded numbly. "Yes. I have the extra joint in my pinky toe. My official diagnosis was quirkless. This only happened, recently." He pointedly avoided the how, when, and where of the acquisition. That felt like a secret too dangerous to share, even with All Might. Toshinori straightened up, a hand on his chin, his mind clearly working a mile a minute. He paced a few steps down the pavement and back, a predator trying to understand a new and fascinating prey. "This explains so much," he murmured, more to himself than to Izuku. "The raw, uncontrolled nature of the manifestation. The lack of registration. The sheer biological horror of it, and the effectiveness." He stopped pacing and fixed Izuku with that intense stare again. "What you have, young man, it is not simply a quirk. In the traditional sense, a quirk is a single, defined biological function. A person emits fire, or has engine calves, or can nullify other powers. It is a static part of their genetic code. What you are describing is a living quirk. A quirk that has its own quirk. The ability to gain new abilities. The potential is staggering. And terrifying. Izuku swallowed hard. Hearing the number one hero validate the terrifying scope of his new reality sent a shiver down his spine. I have a secret, young Midoriya, Toshinori said, his voice dropping low again. You've seen my true form, a secret I have guarded with my life. Now I will tell you another. He gestured to himself, to the frail, skeletal frame that seemed almost lost inside his baggy clothes. My quirk, the one that makes me All Might, was not something I was born with. Izuku's brain screeched to a halt. Of all the revelations of the day, the sludge villain, All Might's injury, his own horrific transformation, this one was perhaps the most earth-shattering. It is a sacred torch, passed down from one generation to the next. A power that is cultivated and given to another. That is its true nature. Toshinori's voice took on a reverent, mythic quality. And the name of this power is One for All, One for All. The name echoed in the chambers of Izuku's heart. It sounded like the title of a legend. One person holds the power, develops it, and then passes it on. Toshinori explained, his gaze distant, as if seeing a long line of figures standing behind him. It is the crystallization of power, a quirk that stockpiles strength. The people who have wielded it have all added their own power to the flame, making it stronger with each succession. I am the eighth wielder of One for All. Izuku could only stare, his mind struggling to process the scale of what he was being told. The symbol of peace, the unshakable pillar of their society, was a legacy. Not a man, but a title, passed down through generations. I was once like you, young Midoriya, Toshinori confessed, and the words struck Izuku with the force of a physical blow. I was born quirkless. The world tilted on its axis. Izuku felt his knees go weak, and he leaned against a nearby telephone pole for support. All Might. The greatest hero of all time, the man whose power seemed as natural and undeniable as the sun in the sky, had been born just like him. A biological dead end. A 4%er. My master, the seventh wielder, saw something in me. Toshinori continued, a sad, fond smile gracing his lips. She saw the heart of a hero, even in a powerless boy. And so she chose me. She passed the torch to me. And with this power, I was able to become the symbol of peace. He coughed, a racking, painful sound, and wiped another speck of blood from his lips. But as you can see, my time is running out. The injury from my fight 5 years ago did more than just limit my hours. It's slowly destroying my body. The flame is guttering. I need to find a successor. He looked at Izuku, and the implication in his gaze was as bright and terrifying as a bolt of lightning. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. Heart rate, 145 BPM. Catecholamine surge detected. Host is experiencing extreme emotional and physiological stress. For months I have been searching, Toshinori said. Searching for someone with the right spirit, the right heart. I never thought I'd find a suitable candidate. But then, today, I saw you, a supposedly quirkless boy terrified, with no hope of winning, who ran into danger because his body moved before he could think. You acted like a true hero. He took a step forward, his skeletal frame seeming to loom over Izuku, filled with an impossible gravity. Young man, I had chosen you even before I saw what your strange power could do. I wanted to offer this power to a boy with the heart of a hero, regardless of his status. But now, he trailed off, looking at Izuku as if seeing him for the first time all over again. Now, the situation has changed. It's no longer just about giving a quirk to the quirkless. He began to pace again, a new, fervent energy in his movements. One for All is a tremendous power. A maelstrom of pure energy. A normal person's body can barely contain it. If a person with a pre-existing quirk inherits it, the results are unpredictable. We've always feared it. Would the quirks merge? Would one be overwritten? Would the host's body tear itself apart from the strain of housing two powerful, competing forces? He stopped and looked at Izuku, his eyes blazing with a new, radical theory. But you are different. Your quirk, this genesis, isn't a static function. You said it yourself? Your body is the hardware, and Genesis is the software. It's a system designed to analyze and integrate new biological information. It's an adaptive operating system. He took another step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, filled with a mad scientist's glee. What if your body, already primed to adapt, to change, to incorporate foreign elements, is the perfect vessel for one for all? What if Genesis doesn't see it as a competing quirk to be fought, but as a massive influx of new data to be managed? A pure, raw energy source to be cataloged and utilized? The idea was staggering. Izuku's mind, which had been reeling, suddenly kicked into high gear, the analytical part of him seizing on the theory. A power that stockpiles power, meeting a power that analyzes and adapts power. It wasn't two quirks in one body. It was an engine and a chassis. A reactor and a containment system. Your power, young Midoriya, Toshinori said, his voice ringing with conviction, is a living blueprint. It is designed to build. One for all is the ultimate engine, a torrent of strength cultivated for generations. Together. He left the sentence hanging, the possibilities branching out into infinity. Together you could create something the world has never seen. A new kind of hero. A new kind of power. He stood before Izuku, no longer a frail, dying man, but the eighth keeper of a sacred flame, extending it forward. I have been searching for a worthy vessel. You are more than worthy. You are, perhaps, uniquely, miraculously suited for this. Izuku Midoriya. I want to offer you my power. I want you to be my successor. The world fell away. The weight of the offer, the sheer, astronomical scale of it, pressed down on Izuku. This was everything he had ever dreamed of, handed to him on a silver platter. The chance to be a hero. The chance to wield the power of his greatest idol. It was a fairy tale, but a dark, cold voice of logic, a voice that was part Genesis and part his own ingrained self-doubt, whispered in his ear. Analysis, one for all. Unknown energy signature. No biological data available. Nature, artificial power transference. Risk assessment, extreme. Integrating a non-biological, high-energy phenomenon could result in catastrophic system failure. Potential outcomes: genetic destabilization, cellular decay, uncontrolled energy discharge, host termination. Potential reward: significant increase in available energy for manifestations. Enhanced physical capabilities. High strategic value. High potential/high risk. The two phrases flashed in his mind, a stark, binary choice. The path of a god, or the path to annihilation. Tears streamed down Izuku's face, hot and silent. He thought of his mother, and how she had always looked at him with such sad, loving eyes, apologizing for a genetic lottery he had lost. He thought of Bakugo, and the years of torment for being powerless. He thought of the doctor and his gentle, dream-killing words. He thought of himself, alone on that beach, trying to move a refrigerator through sheer, pathetic force of will. All his life, he had been on the outside looking in, a spectator to a world of wonders. Now, he was being offered a key to the main event. Not just a ticket, but a starring role. The risk was immense. It could kill him. But the alternative was to go back to being Deku. To have this strange, horrifying power, but to be too afraid to use it to its full potential. To let All Might's legacy, the hope of the entire world, flicker and die because he was scared. No. He wouldn't. He couldn't. He looked up at Toshinori, his tear-streaked face illuminated by a nearby streetlight. He saw the hope in the hero's eyes, the desperate, pleading hope of a man looking for someone to carry his burden. With a shuddering, watery gasp, Izuku nodded. I'll do it, he said, his voice thick with emotion but clear and unwavering. I accept. A vast, profound wave of relief washed over Toshinori's face, so powerful it seemed to momentarily fill out his skeletal frame. He smiled, a genuine, tired but triumphant smile. I knew I wasn't wrong about you. The transfer did not happen that night. Toshinori explained that Izuku's body, while uniquely suited, was still a leaky vessel. Years of malnourishment, and a lack of proper physical development meant that if he were to receive one for all now, his limbs would likely blow right off his body, and so began the Clean Up the Coast Hero Initiative 2.0. But this time, it was different. This time, he had a coach. Over the next 10 months, Izuku's life transformed. Every day before school and every day after, he was at Dagoba Beach. But he was no longer just hauling trash. He was following a meticulously planned, almost sadistically difficult training regimen designed by All Might himself, the American Dream Plan. He was pulling trucks with thick ropes, lifting gargantuan heaps of scrap metal, and running miles in the sand with weights strapped to his body. Genesis was a silent, but active partner in this. Host muscle tissue undergoing hypertrophy. Fibers are tearing and rebuilding. Optimizing protein synthesis and nutrient delivery to damaged areas. Warning: host caloric intake is insufficient for current expenditure. Recommend immediate consumption of 4,000 kcal. Skeletal density increasing in response to stress. Bone remodeling protocol active. The entity within him worked like a hyper-efficient personal trainer and physician, managing his body's recovery and growth on a microscopic level. It purged lactic acid, reinforced microfractures in his bones, and optimized his metabolism. The result was that Izuku was building muscle and endurance at a rate that was frankly unnatural. Toshinori, in his gaunt form, watched from the sidelines, astounded. "Good grief, young man!" He'd wheeze after Izuku successfully pulled a rusted-out bus a few feet. "At this rate, you'll be ready in 8 months, not 10. Izuku, for his part, pushed himself to the absolute brink every single day. The goal, the UA High Entrance exam, was a burning sun on his horizon. He wasn't just building a body to receive a quirk anymore. He was forging a vessel worthy of a sacred trust. He was building the future body of the symbol of peace. He continued his private experiments with Genesis, but he kept them secret, even from Toshinori. He didn't want the hero to think he was relying on a crutch. But in the quiet moments, he would test his limits. He learned to hold the beetle carapace on his hand for a full 30 seconds before the strain became too much. He learned to filter the sensory input from a dog's sense of smell, focusing on a single scent instead of being overwhelmed by the cacophony. He was slowly, painfully, learning control. Finally, the day arrived. It was the morning of the UA entrance exam. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky pink and orange. Dagoba Beach was completely, immaculately clean. The mountains of junk were gone, replaced by pristine, golden sand. Izuku stood on the edge of the retaining wall, looking out at the ocean. 10 months of grueling, back-breaking labor had transformed him. He was still lean, but his body was now a tightly wound coil of wiry muscle, his skin tanned, his posture confident. He stood atop the last remaining pile of scrap, the refrigerator he had failed to move 10 months ago, and let out a raw, triumphant roar at the rising sun. Toshinori, now in his muscle form, stood beside him, beaming with pride. "Excellent work, my boy! A magnificent achievement!" He plucked a single strand of his iconic blonde hair. "Now, for your reward." He held it out to Izuku. "Eat this." Izuku stared at the hair, then at All Might's smiling face. "Ha! To inherit my power, you have to ingest some of my DNA," All Might explained, his smile unwavering. "That's how it works. Now there's no time. You'll be late for the exam. Eat. Eat." Izuku, his mind reeling from the anticlimax and the sheer weirdness of it all, took the hair. Foreign DNA detected. Source: Toshinori Yagi. Contains 1 for all energy signature. Genesis noted clinically. He closed his eyes and, with a grimace, swallowed it. For a moment, nothing happened. He felt no different. Then, a warmth spread from his stomach. A gentle, humming energy that felt like a sunrise in his gut. It was nothing like the cold, invasive violation of his bonding with Genesis. This felt right. Natural. Welcoming. Then the warmth became a fire. The fire became a raging inferno. A torrent of unimaginable power, a river of pure, crackling energy, flooded his system. It was a billion volts of lightning, a supernova exploding in his veins. The gentle hum became a deafening roar in his soul. It was too much. Far, far too much. He screamed, clutching his head as his vision went white. Genesis, which had been a quiet observer, went into overdrive. Catastrophic energy surge detected. Unknown power source. One for all is overloading host neural and biological systems. System-wide failure imminent. Emergency protocol. Contain the surge. Isolate the source. Izuku felt a bizarre internal shift, a feeling of the entity within him desperately building walls, rerouting power, creating firewalls in his own biology. It was like watching a single, tiny dam try to hold back the entire ocean. Genesis wasn't analyzing one for all. It couldn't. The data was too immense, too alien. It was pure energy, not biological code, so it did the only thing it could. It walled it off. It wrapped its own strange, adaptive code around the raging core of One for All, containing it, quarantining it like a virus. It created a buffer zone, treating the immense power not as a new part of the system, but as a volatile, external power plant it could only tap into, not fully integrate. The process was agonizing, a battle being waged on a cellular level. Izuku felt like he was being torn apart and stitched back together 1,000 times a second. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, sweat pouring down his face. The roaring inferno in his veins subsided, contained, leaving behind a vast, thrumming reservoir of power that pulsed at the core of his being, caged but present. Young Midoriya! Are you alright? Tashinori knelt beside him, his face a mask of concern. Izuku looked up, his eyes wild. He could feel it. Two distinct powers, now coexisting within him. The cool, analytical, adaptive hum of Genesis, his symbiotic skin, and beneath it, a caged sun, a sleeping giant of immense, terrifying strength. One for all, he had the blueprint. And now, he had the engine. He pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling but holding. He looked at his hands. They looked the same, but he knew they were not. They were now capable of leveling a city block, and they were also capable of turning into the claws of a crab. He was a paradox. A monster. A hero. I'm okay. He wheezed, a shaky, triumphant smile spreading across his face. I'm ready.